Hello, everyone. I'm Mystery.
And I am Mortimer the Authenticator, reminding you once again that we live in the most absurd timeline, and this is the duality of man.
Yeah, today we are covering Hysteria, and I think we should start by informing people and defining what hysteria is. I have the definition up here. It says a group of psychiatric symptoms, including heightened emotionality, attention seeking behavior, and physical symptoms in the absence of organic pathology. The symptoms of hysteria are currently attributed to any of several psychiatric conditions including blah, 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 including multiple personality disorder, histrionic personality disorder. The term hysteria is no longer used in clinical use, but
Yeah,
as I'm sure you can imagine, it still
yeah,
is a
but
thing.
and to be fair, when we were kind of pitching this episode, um, we were pitching it specifically in the context of moral hysterias and moral panics, um, of which there are a fuck ton um, from history and currently to talk about. Specifically because I watched a video from someone who I very heavily respect, Dr. Justin Sledge, where he was talking about the history of the Satanic Panic. And I noticed several parallels between the Satanic Panic of the 70s, 80s, 90s, and early 2000s and the modern, I guess what you could call it, the broader social justice hysteria. I mean, we occasionally refer to the various moral panics of the 20th century as the family values hysteria, and I guess we could call this the social justice hysteria. The funny thing, though, and what made me want to talk about this in this context was in that same video on the channel Esoterica. Please do go and watch because it's an awesome channel, especially if you're interested in the history of esoteric philosophy in general. But the funny thing was, Dr. Justin Sledge, did not see the parallels between, for example, um, implanting memories in children during the Satanic Panic and taking advantage of psychological maladies to um, presuppose gender dysphoria like we see in the modern day world. But we'll get into that as we go along because there are other variations on today's moral panic mystery wants to go into, and he blindsided me with right before we went on. So take it away, E. What new
Yeah,
madness, what new spore of madness have we today?
yeah.
Oh,
So we mentioned before about environmentalists defacing various works of historical art, and I think that's very apropos in this discussion because the climate agenda has reached levels of hysteria, as I'm
it's
sure
a,
you
it's
all
a
agree.
very active wing of the, again, sort of the overarching grouping of what we could call social justice hysterias.
And I'm sure many of you will have heard the story about a couple of girls from a group, I believe it's called Just Stop Oil, attempting to deface a Van Gogh in, I believe, a British museum.
Which has my gun skeptical ass thinking, is it appropriate to get a gun? It might be time to finally get a gun.
I mean, thankfully, the masterpiece was behind glass, so it wasn't actually stained, but it did get on the, I believe, the frame, and I believe they also glued themselves to the wall.
Yes, they did. Again, they do that a lot. They deface a piece of art, or at least attempt to, and then they root themselves to the spot to make a modern art piece, quote unquote, spectacle of themselves.
Yeah, it's like if you were just reasonable people with, information and facts go to talk to people, that would have a better job of convincing people than this. Because what you're doing now is you're just pissing people off. And I gotta say, I I am now going to v- vote against these people because this kind of behavior cannot be supported at all. It just can't. These people must lose.
when the line between the destruction of a Van Gogh painting and the preservation of a Van Gogh painting is literally a pane of glass, we have officially gone too far. And also, I want to point this out because this is again, we're trying to kind of fixate this within the context of like the tendency towards moral panics in general or moral hysteria in general. And the thing is, people with arguments, i.e., reasoned, rational arguments, people who come to positions by way of reasoned logic and argumentation and occasionally evidence, make arguments for their case, sometimes publicly, but they make arguments for their case. Moral Puritans of any given description, however, make public spectacles of themselves in lieu of arguments. And which category do you go ahead and suppose defacing a Van Gogh painting and then rooting yourself to the spot like a piece of performance art falls under? Ahem.
I mean, I'm assuming the plan is just to annoy people to get what they want, so that they'll shut up and go away. That's literally the tactics of children.
Well, it's not. It's more complicated than that, and we touched on this a long ass time ago, back when we
And
were still
I do
on E's main channel. Um, the
I do
the
remember that it is a cult mentality, but even though not all cults have the same tactics necessarily.
no, but the logic, and again, put that in Grand Canyon size air quotes, please. The logic is they possess knowledge of impending doom. Essentially, that it's a tendency that's occasionally referred to in anthropological and literary circles as apocalypticism. It's essentially the logic of we, the enlightened ones, have knowledge of impending doom, and the banal pleasantries of people's creature comforts are keeping them from being made aware of this particular issue. So we need to inconvenience people's daily lives and creature comforts as much as possible so that they will wake up to the pending apocalypse, basically.
I gotta
It,
say, Doom must be
an
stuck in
attempt to
traffic
red
because they've
pill
been saying
people is
this
what
stuff
it's
since
trying to
the
do,
50s.
but it's not working.
And I was saying Doom must be stuck in traffic because they've been saying this stuff since the 50s.
Yeah, apocalypticism has never been far away when it comes to moralistic hysteria. Whether it's the hyper traditionalistic tradcon family values hysteria of bygone decades and by the previous century, or it's the social justice hysteria of the modern world. Apocalypticism and moral hysteria tend to go well together because in some ways it's nihilistic apocalypticism, i.e., everything is terrible, therefore the world must be ending, and or everything we love must be coming crashing down around us. That I think in some ways leads to moral fervor, i.e., if we believe the world is ending and we're the ones trying to prevent the world from ending, then extreme behavior is warranted because, well, the consequences of avoiding this is far more extreme and far more harmful than anything we might do in the interim to try and convince people to be on the quote unquote right side of history.
Yeah, I think it's really hilarious. These people are saying carbon emissions and climate change are going to end the world as we sit on the knife's edge of World War III.
Yeah, it's like I hate to burst your bubble, but the the environmental issues that may or may not be pending are at the very least on quite a large like planetary timescale here. Um, the nuclear button, on the other hand, is quite capable of being pushed in the space of an afternoon. I and also nuclear devastation is far more of a permanent issue for the environment than fossil fuel emissions are. Because as bad as fossil fuel emissions have the potential to be, and they do have at least the potential to be bad, they are also something that nature can reclaim over a long enough time scale. Nuclear radiation, though, has a hell of a shelf life. So much so that there is still heightened levels of background radiation on Earth from when they were testing the Manhattan Project. So for our generation, our parents' generation, and our grandparents' generation, or at least, my grandparents' generation, and probably yours too, because we're, you know, late 20s or late 30s between the two of us. So, yeah, all of those generations grew up at a time where there was greater than usual background radiation on the planet Earth because of the Manhattan Project. Never mind all the other nuclear detonations and whatnot that are still keeping that background radiation high, and never mind the possible health risks and issues of issues of development that might be caused by heightened levels of background radiation. But yeah, nukes are basically nature's personal kill switch. It, I often make the joke that the reason the atom explodes in a nuclear bomb is sort of a you had one job and now I'm pissed off at you for not abiding by the one job of don't split the fucking atom rage. That the atomic explosions are basically nature's personal rage of like you had one job, one universal rule, don't fucking split the atom, and we went and split the atom, and now you explode.
Yeah. We
Yeah,
should do
but
an
anyway,
episode
back
about
to back
things.
to moral panics of modern and historical context.
Yeah, but the Greens aren't quite done yet because you see, there was an incident in, I believe, various London supermarkets by a group called Animal Rebellion. And what they did was they went over to the dairy section, grabbed the milk, and started pouring it all over the floors as a way of protesting against, I believe, the dairy and meat industries because they say they want to transition to a plant based food future. And this is also, according to them, to fight climate change. I had a steak yesterday. I'm having chicken today, chicken tomorrow, and I'm going to have a steak Friday just because fuck these people.
You have radicalized everyone into the anyone but you category. But okay, let's because I've actually had conversations with sane vegans. That they're seemingly rare, but they do exist. There are sane vegans out there who actually bother to make arguments for their positions rather than just being moralistic hysteria. Cough, cough. Vegan gains, cough. Um, and Beacon Gaines is also a goddamn sociopath, but that's neither here nor there. Um, about the dairy industry, and something about the dairy industry that I didn't previously know until I was informed about this from someone who, again, sane vegan, um, is in order to stimulate the heifers to give milk when they're not pregnant, you basically have to electroshock their udders into convulsing in such a way as to produce milk. So there are possible ethical breaches for the consumption of dairy products, and and I'm not saying this as someone who abstains from those things. By the way, I drink maybe a half a gallon of milk a day, sometimes more if I'm thirsty. Um, I'm I am well aware that I am a massive hypocrite with regards to this. But that being said, there are possible ethical arguments to be made for the dairy industry in the same way as I think we're all relatively on the same page that um, free-range farming is infinitely better than factory farming, and I think we would all be happy if factory farming was a distant memory of the distant past. And I
Yeah.
don't think you need to be some kind of eco warrior or vegan moralist to get there. But at the same time, these people are not making any of the incredibly sane ethical arguments that sane vegans everywhere make. They're not making the please slowly wean yourself away from this or wait until we have justifiable substitutes for these things. They are making the moralist argument of you are passively encouraging this bad thing, and therefore we are going to make a public goddamn spectacle of ourselves and rant and rave moralistically and hysterically.
Not only that, but there's been rumblings from a lot of different sources that there could be an upcoming food crisis. So I think, you know,
Yeah, food waste, not
splashing
a good
milk over the
idea at this
floor.
particular juncture. Again, the looming spectacle of if Biden or Putin decides to be just the tiniest bit more warmongery than they should be, we could be living in a very Fallout New Vegas-y situation in the space of about a month.
Yeah, and not only that, but there's also one thing also you have to consider: the poor son of a bitch who's gonna have to clean that shit up.
Yeah, definitely going to be a member of the working class. And as I recall, we were under strict instructions to have solidarity with the working class and
But
all of that
also,
all of
how much
that
do you want to
quasi
bet that
Marxist Hegelian shit.
how
So
much do you bet that all these people are like from the upper middle class, rich families who have enough time and resources where they don't have to worry about working or making sure their bills are paid
I
or
think if
trying
I
to
I think
save.
if I bet money on that, I could be a member of the upper middle class before too long. I would get a return on that investment.
Yeah, these people are just
It's funny, for as much as they have contempt for what they define to be the bourgeoisie, they are some of the bougiest motherfuckers in the history of Western civilization.
it's like the stupid rebellious teenage phase never ended with these people.
No, and and to be fair, youthful rebellion is a good thing in quite a lot of cases, because sometimes generations get set in their ways, or they accord far too much authority to norms, or they simply don't consider ways they could keep the good things they have while making them more efficient or better. So youthful rebellion is a good thing, and youthful irreverence is also a good thing. But this is the other thing, and this is the ultimate thing that I have with these people. You can't simultaneously be the virtuous put upon rebels and the fuddy-duddy moral authoritarians. Because here's the thing: when people who are genuinely aggrieved rise up against their quote unquote oppressors, that is a good thing. When people who already exist within the halls of power behave in the exact same way, that is paranoia. And that is usually the main fuel source and precursor to tyranny. I.e., when actual rebels rebel, it's a good thing because it's a balancing of the scales. When people in the halls of power think they are being oppressed or are being persecuted and use the powers at their disposal to essentially tamp down on anyone they fear might be scheming against them, that is megalomaniacal paranoia of the worst, most dictatorial kind. So it is very important when you are trying to speak truth to power, my dear moralistic friends, that you understand two very important things. Number one, where the truth is and what it is. and two, where the power is and what it is. Because if you don't understand those two very important things, or I guess four if we're counting them separately, you don't understand where those things are, you may find yourself in a situation where you still fear the mustache twirling, tradcon, family values patriarchy of yesteryear, while simultaneously being the heads of all the major corporations, every institution in Hollywood, every institution in journalism, and of course, every institution in academia. And I'm looking around here in this world in which we currently find ourselves, and guess where all of you moralistic twits are, while still simultaneously claiming to be the rebels.
Yeah, and one of the things that's funny is that they're always doing this in countries who comparatively actually have a pretty low carbon emission rate, whereas in countries like India and China, where the carbon emission rate is much
Whistle,
higher,
whistle, nothing to see here.
nobody
If you
there
put this on
gives
the
a
news, you'll never work in this town again.
yeah, nobody there cares.
Yeah, 70% of the carbon emissions on this planet today are coming out of the manufacturing hubs in China. And yet you are virtue signaling for the people in the West who are responsible for maybe 10% of the overall carbon emissions. And don't get me wrong, minimizing things by 10% is fine, but I sort of feel like it's important to point out that we were approximately where China is now about 30 or 40 years ago, and we did a bunch of common sense eco regulations that virtually eliminated our carbon footprint. Um, so if we could have done that 30 or 40 years ago and gotten from where China is now to, again, roughly 10% of the emissions, why don't you advocate for China to adopt the things we adopted back in the frickin' 70s? And then, boom, you will have reduced the 70% of carbon emissions to 20% maybe. And that strikes me as a much better and more constructive way of going about your goal than it otherwise would. But then again, as I said, these people are more motivated by abstract morality and persecution complexes than they are by actual reason. In exactly the same way, by the way, that the satanic panic of yesteryear, despite the fact that, all the major institutions were very heavily Christian influenced, were whining and complaining that D&D, rock and roll, movies, books, television, just all of the things were corrupting the youth.
They just say I am a Christian and I enjoy all of those things.
Uh-huh. And yeah, by the way, obviously I don't mean to impugn all of Christianity with this shit. I just mean that I've seen this uncomfortable thing lately where some people on ostensibly my side are beginning to go, well, the social justice moral panic is so bad. I guess the only option we have is to go back to the family values moral panic and the satanic panic moral panic and the red scare moral panic. And I'm like, yeah, no, there are other options. Like, the thing I always say is, you guys do know that there are four quadrants in the political compass, right? You don't have to choose between authoritarian right leaning shit or authoritarian left leaning shit. You can move down the axis and choose a libertarian option. Either libertarian option would be good, in my opinion. It's far more important to me that we move vertically than where we move horizontally. Because I can live in a left-wing libertarian society, and I can live in a right-wing libertarian society, and I can live in a centrist libertarian society. But you know where I can't live? I can't live in an authoritarian society, and wouldn't you go ahead and know it? That's where we're currently sitting, or at least on the road to.
Yeah, and it's always done. whether it be from a left wing or a right wing, by people who think that they know better than literally everyone else for whatever reason.
Yep.
Whether they use the Bible for this or they use some university constructed
Yeah.
ideology.
Whether it's my God or my people, it's always we are the ones who speak for the correct view, and therefore.
Yes. And this is something that can never be discussed or challenged or maybe reconsidered. That once they
And
have
what's
their
more,
belief,
if you try to, then you are just secretly in line with all of the worst aspects of our strawman version of you, and therefore you are the evil one. And
yeah,
I had this sort of aha moment earlier today where I thought about the movie from the 90s called Mazes and Monsters. For those that don't know, it was basically the like apotheosis of or the epitome of the D&D causes Satanism argument. I was thinking about that. And then I was thinking about the way that the current bugbear of the moral panic was treated in the recent Disney Plus series She-Hulk. For those that don't know, there was a group in She-Hulk called the Intelligentsia, who, rather than being the supervillain cabal that it was in the comics, led by the leader, it was basically the worst aspects of Twitter, YouTube, 4chan, and Reddit all rolled into one and strawman like fuck.
sounds fun. I haven't watched She-Hulk.
Don't. It's you will regret the use of your time if you do so. Don't do it. It's not worth it. But what I mean is take what take a look at what Mazes and Monsters did to the counterculture who likes D&D, or the counterculture who likes goth aesthetic, or the counterculture who liked punk back in the day. And take a look at what She-Hulk did to the counterculture of today and play a little game of spot the difference. Because I genuinely cannot, for the life of me, spot any difference other than one side would say, well, yeah, we were justified in thinking X. And they don't seem to pay attention to the fact that that's exactly what the other side says at any like this is the thing. It's like the people who say there were actual communists in Hollywood during the Red Scare, and therefore the Red Scare was justified. What they're missing by saying that is the problem with the Red Scare was not the legitimacy or lack of legitimacy of the communist threat. The problem was, while I don't agree with communism and probably fucking never will, at least as long as I have a functioning brain, people should be free to believe in communism. What they are not free to do is propagandize. Just like I have no problem with a Nazi being a Nazi in the privacy of his own fucking thoughts, but if he starts goose stepping and marching people off to a gas chamber he built in his backyard, then I will start to kick up a fuss. I.e., the existence of the people who think a certain way is not the problem. It is the actions they choose to carry out that could foreseeably be a problem. And sadly
And
enough, yeah, go ahead.
this is something that I've often gotten into an argument with people online. Like people always say that the ends justify the means, or there are no bad tactics, only bad targets. No, the means by which you accomplish your goal matter. For example, you could have the goal of ending homelessness in America, which most people would consider to be a worthy goal, but you have to consider the means by which you accomplish it. Because technically speaking, if you kill all the homeless people, you will have
Homelessness is
ended
no longer a
homelessness.
problem. but it sort of defeats the point of the fucking thing, don't you see? And here's the other side of the ends justify the means argument and why it doesn't make any logical sense either. Take out the empirical part of it. Take out the empirical part of it for a second. If the supposition, the ends justify the means, was true, why would you have to say it? By that I mean, in a situation where the ends actually do justify the means, you usually don't even need to parse the ends and the means because the ends and the means are both either morally neutral or morally good. The only reason why the phrase the ends justify the means needs to exist is when there is some kind of destructive interference or dissonance between your understanding of the end and understanding of the means. And if that be the case, that means on some level you logically understand that the ends don't justify the means, and you are trying to cover your ass in it. I realize I just went on a big logical spiel and then went extremely informal with it, but that's the long and the short of it. In a world where the ends justify the means, you don't notice the means because the ends are actually functioning to compensate for them. But in a world where the ends don't justify the means, you need the phrase the ends justify the means to cover the obvious dissonance that you can already see between the ends and the means. Because most of the time when we do things, we don't even notice the means because most of the time we don't, like if I expend the energy to get up and go turn on or off a light switch, am I waxing philosophical about the effort it's going to take for me to stand up and then go and turn off or on the light switch? No, because there is literally no reason to do so. But if I have to say, just if I have to enslave a cat to run on a wheel to power my lights, and then I get up and go turn or on or off the light switch, or if the cat dies when I turn on or off the light switch, then I'm gonna fucking notice the means now, aren't I? Because the means and the ends do not follow from one another necessarily or otherwise. Usually when we find ourselves in the situation where we want to use the ends justify the means as an argument, it's because there's some dissonance between the ends and the means, and we're thinking to ourselves, hang on, there must surely be a way to get X end without Y means, because Y means strike me as either immoral or just plain inefficient.
Yeah, and not only that, but you'll like people often say, I'm doing this because it's the lesser of two evils. The problem with that is it's
You're
still
still
evil.
knowingly committing an evil.
Yeah, and I feel like these people in their own insane minds might not feel that they have any other choice. But the thing is, even when you approach them with an alternative option, they're still not going to take it.
Well, it's the logical issue of the false dichotomy, i.e., if you are absolutely certain on some level that an evil must be committed, and now you only have to choose between the lesser of two evils, then that logic makes sense. But of course, the crafty Socratic logician comes in and goes, "Hang on, have you guys considered options that wouldn't involve committing an evil?" It's the issue I've always had with the fucking trolley problem in philosophical circles. Most people know what the trolley problem is by now. One side of the track has one person on it, another side of the track has five people on it. And my solution to that has always been either stop the train and or untie people from the tracks, or, and this is usually my answer when I'm asked the trolley problem, because usually there's some stipulation of there isn't enough time to untie people from the tracks and there isn't a way to stop the train. My solution to the trolley problem in that case is get out in front of the trolley and sacrifice yourself to slow it down. Because here's the thing with the trolley problem. In the event that you don't know anything about the people who you are going to sacrifice in this hypothetical trolley problem, the only ethical option is self-sacrifice, because you don't know the good or evil status of the individual on one side of the track, and you don't know the ethical status of the 5 people on the other side of the track. What you do know, however, is yourself. You know yourself well enough to make a judgment about yourself. Therefore, if you remove yourself from the equation by way of self-sacrifice, the only person that you have harmed, if you have harmed anyone at all, is yourself. And if you're a little bit like me and you hyper-focus on everything you've ever done wrong, you can even sometimes convince yourself that if you remove yourself from the equation but not anyone else, then you possibly have done the world a service by removing one of the bad people. Whereas in literally any other arrangement of the trolley problem, you are either getting rid of a morally neutral person because you don't know anything about them, or you are in a 50-50% chance of killing a good person or killing an evil person. And then, of course, there's the moral issue of choosing to kill a second person when self-sacrifice is on the table. And most people, I think, are going to agree with me when I say, if your choice is between killing another random person who has done you no harm and or sacrificing yourself, it's kind of sadistic and self-serving to prioritize your own life over someone who randomly just by their existence and has done you no harm. If it's a self-defense situation, that's an entirely different bear. But in the trolley problem, you're specifically talking about random people. Just like the trolley problem variables change if, for example, Hitler is one person on one side of the track and Mother Teresa, Jesus, Mahatma Gandhi, and Confucius are on the other side of the track, or vice versa. If the one person on the side of the track is the Buddha, and the 5 people on the other side of the track are Ivan the Terrible, Joseph Stalin, Hitler, and etc. At that point, we're like, yep, kill the 5. But in a situation where you know nothing about anyone in this trolley problem, self-sacrifice is, in my opinion, the most sane option.
I've heard the argument that the only solution to the trolley problem is to walk away from the switch, as because you are not the person who put these people in this situation. If you
Yeah,
if you alter the switch, then you bear the responsibility for that decision. But if you walk away, then the one responsible is the one who tied them to the track in the first place.
yeah, but there will still be a death, and it's not really about responsibility at that point. It's about and in some ways you can make the argument that being neutral in such a situation is in of itself a yeah, you have to make the choice to walk away. You have to make the choice to not get involved. And as we've seen in many a situation in real life with the I was just following the orders type people, or the I was just being a bystander while someone was getting mugged, in the corner of the street. Um, Inaction is not exactly morally defensible. Again, I would make the case that you should
I
do
think those
something.
situations are a bit different, especially with the mugging one, because in the trolley problem, no matter what decision you actively make at the thing, death will occur either way. Whereas
Yeah.
if you act in order to stop someone from being mugged, you could almost certainly
You
save
could
someone's life.
exasperate you could exasperate the problem. My point is, I don't jive with the people who go, well, it's not my fault, so it's not on my hands. Well, at the same time, many a situation may not directly be your fault, but at the same time continuing to perpetuate it or continuing to be indifferent to it is a bit of a problem. Whereas, again, my solution, you take an action, you take the action of getting out in front of the trolley to commit self-sacrifice, and you minimize the death of everyone who is not you. And given that you are the most informed about who you are, yourself is the only person in this situation you have the capacity to judge. And by taking the quotient of death that is going to occur regardless, onto yourself, you have either saved 6 people at the cost of your own life, which is a morally defensible option, or you have derailed the trolley and caused random actions to occur that would then kill yourself and other people. But at the very least, it's not immoral in that case because you have taken that responsibility onto yourself and essentially left it up to natural causes, which you have no control over.
Regarding the self-sacrifice one, while I do believe the logic behind it is sound, there is the fact that if you do sacrifice yourself, because no man exists in the vacuum, your death will have effect on the people who were connected to you, and people have taken their own lives out of
Yes.
a great loss.
Although, again, to be fair, in the context of the trolley problem, you're dying in the hopes of killing 6 or saving the lives of 6 people. And I have to say that in such a situation, that is one hell of an epitaph. Like, that is obviously not living with myself in this case because death is by its very nature, but that is a death that I think most people could live with. Whereas the other option of, well, I'm just not going to get involved, I'm going to abstain from this game entirely, that is extremely morally dubious, and I think that could cause someone to commit suicide. But anyway, we've gotten off onto the trolley problem issue and forwent the moralistic hysteria issue.
So you were, I believe, speaking about the Satanic Panic and the Red Scare.
Yeah, the issue I have with the Red Scare is the way it's taught in most cases, a la the Arthur Miller Crucible situation, is there were no communists, or people were being communist, but in a completely harmless way, and the big bad government or Joseph McCarthy, who actually wasn't all that involved in the actual historical Red Scare, but that's a different story, was persecuting them erroneously. And then you get the other half of the argument, especially recently, where they go, actually, if you look at things historically, there were communists in Hollywood at the time, and therefore the Red Scare was perfectly justified. To which my response is, you're both missing the point of the issue. Because yes, historically there were communists in Hollywood, but no, that doesn't make the Red Scare justified. Because, again, the issue is not people being communists. The issue is people being communists in such a way that it is harmful, i.e., inserting propaganda into movies. And even then, that's somewhat dubious when you consider that on some level, everyone skews the art they make in accordance with their worldview to some degree. So there's an argument to be made of a communist makes a pro-communist movie essentially by accident, by just portraying something he considers to be morally good, versus a communist makes a communist movie specifically biased in the hopes that it will make communism sound good. To which my response is, again, I'm not worried about a Nazi in the privacy of his own thoughts being a Nazi. I'm going to judge him if and only if he starts with the goose stepping and the marching people off into a gas chamber, right? To put it another way, I'm not worried about communists being communists. I'm worried about communists trying to bring about communism. And in the same way, I'm not worried about Nazis being Nazis. I'm worried about them engaging in the practice of Naziing, for lack of a better word. Because the harm is the point at which things should be considered. But that's neither here nor there. The point.
Uh,
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, you just mentioned Nazis. I just want to say that regarding the current moral panic, it would seem that the demand for Nazism far outstrips the supply. As I'm sure you've been aware, anybody and their dog is being called a Nazi nowadays.
Well, I
And
mean, go ahead.
I know they talk about Ashkenaz, but I'm just saying that that speaks to the hysteria. People who are very clearly not Nazis are, being called Nazis by these hysterics, and going so far as well. Nazi is the most terrible thing you can do. Therefore, anything you do against them is obviously justified, which is their twisted
Yeah,
mindset.
if we are the anti-fascists, then anything you do in response to us that isn't fawning praise must be some kind of softcore fascism. And here is where it gets interesting, because that usually actually tends to happen towards moral panics, because are moral panics function in the moral abstract, i.e., they're more motivated by the moral logic of a situation than they are by the actual Socratic logic of a situation, or the evidence. And you see this kind of thing in historical moral panics as well. Um, for as much as there were actual communists in the Red Scare, there were also people who were just Scandinavian style social democrats, um,
Yeah.
or um, socially liberal, like, um, or classical liberal people who were
Yes.
just not conser- who just didn't hold conservative moral values, who got erroneously conflated into the category of communist. Or, again, famously in the Salem witch trials, or the burning times in general, we're so paranoid about witches that anyone who so much as looks at herbs the wrong way, off to the stake with you. Um,
Um, I think this is best
yeah,
summarized by a certain congresswoman from New York when years ago she said it was better to be morally correct than factually accurate.
yeah, thoroughly no. And I would make the argument that the place where a moral panic begins is that place where logical conflation takes the or conflation takes the place of logical argumentation. Because if it's just an argument between two different sides, or if it's just a single person expressing their views, that is one thing. When it becomes, I can't even bring myself to listen to you because I'm worried about being corrupted by your position, then it's a moral panic. We see this in the satanic panic of the old days as well. Like, when a goth person, or a person who um, subscribed to the punk movement, or someone who played D&D, or a rock star would say, "You are erroneously conflating me with Satanism when I have nothing to do with Satanism," and the morally puritanical family values type would say, I can't even listen to you, because either you're mistaken and you're being tricked into worshiping the devil without your knowledge, or you're being malicious and trying to trick me into believing this so that you can continue along the corruptive ways you do. And you see this too in the modern world, with the framing of, you should never listen to someone you think is a fascist when they try to defend their beliefs, because fascists always lie about their beliefs. Which brings up the question of, okay, how is it possible to even define fascism then? Because if even Giovanni Gentile's definition of fascism and Mussolini's own personal definition of fascism were either lying or inaccurate, to what are you referring when you refer to a fascist? And
Yeah.
it's the same thing with the witch trial example I gave earlier, and we'll go into this more next week. Um,
But, regarding D&D, I think as someone who plays D&D a lot and who's a big fan of it, um, those people clearly have no idea what they're talking about because you can literally do whatever you want in D&D. Like the books themselves are basically just guidelines and not necessarily
Here is a
rules. I mean,
framework to operate within, otherwise go nuts, basically.
yeah, because personally, in a campaign I was running with some friends from college, I actually ended up derailing the campaign by attempting to form an inquisition to purge a city of heretical beliefs.
Well, if that's not thematically appropriate for this week, I don't know what is. Um,
Obviously, I'm not that zealous in my beliefs, but that's the thing about D&D. You can play something that you are not.
or you can mock something that you are not, which I imagine was a large part of your Inquisitor character, was you were essentially mocking that kind of zealous attitude, and so much the fucking better. Um, but there are so many parallels. Getting back to kind of the main impetus of this video. When I watched that video on Esoterica that went into the history of the Satanic Panic, I was stunned by how many parallels there actually were between the Satanic Panic of yesteryear and the modern social justice moral panic. I've always known, and I've often said, that I found many parallels between the Satanic Panic and the modern day social justice moral panic. But what I didn't realize was how many almost one-to-one parallels there were. And the more detailed Dr. Sledge's explanation got, um, the more the more stunned I got with just how many abject parallels there were. But the funny thing was he didn't see any parallels between the Satanic Panic and the trans kids issue or hashtag Me Too. And in fact, he was more worried about a coming right wing, essentially revival of the Satanic Panic, and didn't see any aspects of a moral panic in the social justice side of things. And it
No,
made me think, because it's like, oh, I see, you have a blind spot here because to you this seems normal. And in many ways that was how it was during the Satanic Panic. If you went up to somebody who was a dyed in the wool satanic panicker, they would be confused as to what you were trying to point out, because it's hard to it's hard to see the absurdity of the moralistic hysteria when you're sort of in the event horizon of the moralistic hysteria. It's that same phenomena we've talked about many times now of being worldview blind, where you think you're holding to a given principle, because whenever someone tries to point out your hypocrisies to you, you genuinely think it's a false equivalency, and you don't see what where the parallels between the thing you're doing and the thing your enemies do are. It's it's both fascinating and disturbing at the same time, because again, you look at the history of the Satanic Panic, where teachers and psychologists would implant false memories into children. Now, to defend them, they didn't know what psychic driving was or implanting memories was. They thought that hypnotic memory regression was an actual um, practical tool, because that was before we really fully understood how memories worked. But in their attempt to reawaken or recover lost memories, they would distort someone's subconscious in such a way their brain would manufacture false memories for them. And
Yeah.
there's a very similar parallel between that and today's phenomena of trans kids. You see people with universal dysphoria, i.e., social dysphoria, like people with autism, people with other um, spectrum disorders, etc.,
Yeah,
who have
basically, people who are
basically
just awkward.
who basically have a universal dysphoria, i.e., they don't really jive with any humans because they don't have um the neurological framing to do so, and they are being inculcated into the idea of gender dysphoria because someone notices they have a dysphoria, and they sort of fiat assume, oh, you have a dysphoria, it must be gender dysphoria. You must be a boy autistic girl who doesn't behave in a feminine manner, or you must be a girl feminine boy who doesn't really operate in a masculine manner. And in the same way as you get testimonials even now from kids who were the who were used during the Satanic Panic, who were the victims of these implanted memories, and who now viscerally hate the Satanic Panic for what it did to them. I'm betting in the space of about 20 years, you are going to get a massive amount of testimony, and it's even starting now. You're going to get a massive testimonial of, I had various autistic spectrum disorders, or I had other perceptual disorders or personality disorders, and I was erroneously diagnosed with gender dysphoria, and as a result got surgery, and now my life is ruined and my biology is basically a non-starter.
Yeah, you're seeing a lot of these. I've seen a lot of videos on YouTube, testimonials from people who have detransitioned, and they talk about how basically um, they weren't given like another choice by the people that they went to for help. You know, it's I believe it's a I believe it was a study that showed that like I believe what was it 80% of people with gender dysphoria eventually um, end up resolving it without needing surgery. And so
Yeah.
now people are just basically being funneled through this because isn't it the AMA that says you can only give gender affirming psychiatric care?
And here's the other niggling little detail about that whole gender affirming canard. Um, you would think that one of the possible options for someone with gender dysphoria would be giving them gender affirming hormones, i.e., if a boy doesn't feel masculine enough, why not give him some testosterone to encourage gender affirmation, i.e., instead of instead of encouraging them to transition, why not try to give them gender affirming hormones in the sense of help them to affirm the gender that that their biology would indicate rather than trying to transition away from it. Because most of the time, especially in prepubescence, um, gender dysphoria is just a matter of not having enough exposure to um, the appropriate gendered hormones. I.e., if you're a male human but you are lacking um, male hormones, it's easier for you to feel dysphoria. And likewise, if you're a female human who is lacking estrogen or other female hormones, it's easier for you to experience dysphoria. I'm wondering if one of the upshots of this in 20 years, because yes, while I agree there are plenty of testimonials now for detransitioning, and and likewise there were during the Satanic Panic plenty of I was told I was satanically abused and then found out later that it was an implanted. There were plenty of people who were skeptical of that even then. Um, and much like that, I think the detransitioning stories you're getting now will come to basically be the vanguard or the drop in the bucket of the deluge that's going to occur in 20 years when the dust is settled, and the orthodoxy of the modern world is able to be questioned by hindsight, because of course hindsight is 2020. And in the same way, moral panics almost always breed from moral orthodoxy, i.e., if we're absolutely certain that this one framework that everyone, or at least most people, share in common is the correct moral framework, then we don't even need to consider options outside of the moral framework, i.e., we don't need to consider that atheists just don't believe in God. We have to call them moral. We don't even consider that polytheists are good people. They must be satanic witches. We can't even consider that D&D and punk and rock and roll are just youthful counterculture. They must be something that's going to degrade our youth. It, it's
Yeah, and
always an orthodoxy thing.
one thing that I've noticed is the play on the desire to do what most people would consider good. Like one of the things they will do is they will play on a parent's desire to protect their children and fear of harm coming to them. Like a lot of things, other times they'll say, "Would you prefer a dead son or a living daughter?" And basically, in saying like, if you don't do this, if you don't transition your son to be a girl, then he will um, commit suicide. And so, parents obviously not wanting it to happen to their child, they go along with the whole transitioning thing.
Or vice versa in the old days, would you rather um aren't you worried that your child will be led astray and that their generation will bring an end to civilization? Won't somebody please think of the famous Helen Lovejoy quote from The Simpsons? Um, all we really did as a society, it appears, is swap out the Helen Lovejoys for the Karens. And I'm gonna say it right now. I despise all moral panics, no matter from which side they come, because I'm against moralism. And just to be clear, that does not therefore mean I am against morality. You can be moral, or you can have concerns for morality without being moralistic. And what's more, you can still be an ethical person without even considering morality, because morality and ethics are actually two separate things. And I think one of the
Regarding
go ahead.
sorry not to interrupt you, but regarding the switch from right to left, as you mentioned, there's a quote about racism from, I believe, Thomas Sowell that I think that would be very appropriate here regarding racism. But I guess you could apply this to moral panics as well. He said that racism has been absolutely horrible everywhere it's existed in all of human history. I have no idea how you thought that you would solve the problem simply by putting it under new management.
Yep. And that's why I mentioned earlier the fact that the political compass has four quadrants, i.e., two authoritarian ones and two libertarian ones. Because what it appears to have happened is, in response to the justified routing of the family values, tradcon, satanic panicking, red scaring, um, seduction of the innocent reading zeitgeist, which was justified. Fuck the tradcons in that particular instance. Um, the people that won that argument went further and further into their own framework. But here's the problem. As with all people who are motivated primarily by moralism, they don't acknowledge that they have auth- any authoritarian tendencies or any authoritarian possibilities. I.e., you'll get this from you'll get this from right-leaning people, you'll get this from left-leaning people. there's no possible way we can be authoritarian because we are the people who opposed authoritarianism the last time. To the point that I've seen people on both extremes advocate for getting rid of the political compass test because it does draw an equivalency between the possibility of left-wing authoritarianism and the possibility of right-wing authoritarianism. It doesn't matter how often you point out right-leaning theocracies like the Muslim world or the medieval Catholic Church. It doesn't matter how much you point out people like Stalin and Mussolini and Hitler being on the left-wing side. And yes, they are on the left-wing side, don't at me. But these people want to believe that it's not just a right versus left issue, that right and left are the only markers for good and evil, i.e., no one could ever possibly be right-leaning and evil, they must all be moral. Or no one could possibly be left-wing and authoritarian, they must all be moral. But I have to point out this again, instead of picking between social justice and family values, we could all come to a situation where instead of moving right to left, we move down, i.e., I don't care what paradigm we wind up in, as long as it's in that lower half of the spectrum somewhere. I want, if we are truly going to change the paradigm entirely and upgrade the political compass test, I could support that. But the parts of the political compass I want to get rid of are the top half there, because I don't think there's any need for this kind of moralistic hysteria, i.e., you shouldn't be able to say, won't somebody please think of the children, and get somebody lynched, a la the Helen Lovejoy example. But you also shouldn't be able to say, won't somebody please think of insert demographic, and get people deplatformed or transitioned or any number of other possible options. And it's funny to me because in addition to the logical parallels between the Satanic Panic or the family values moral panics of yesteryear and the modern social justice moral panics of today, you'll get literal parallels. And one of the most perfect ones is Lady J.K. Rowling. Because it wasn't so very long ago, and I'm pretty sure that you and I both can remember it, when there were book burnings for J.K. Rowling because they were so concerned that Harry Potter might make people interested in trying witchcraft for real.
I mean, I went to church every Sunday. I still read Harry Potter.
Yeah, and I'm probably a bad example because I did end up actually getting involved in magic and the occult, but I will tell you this. Harry Potter, apart from maybe being the first fantasy series I ever was interested in, had next to nothing to do with it because apart from any moral considerations one way or the other, Harry Potter is a terrible representation of occultism. Absolutely horrible. It's not going to convert your children to any substantive variety of witchcraft or magic or the occult because it's simply not a good representation of them.
Yeah,
at
she
all.
basically made up her own magic system, like a lot of people do in fantasy stories, with some references to some things
Yeah,
from the.
well, the thing is with J.K. Rowling, I'm not convinced she even did because magic systems at least imply a complete system, whereas J.K. I don't even think she knows the mechanics of how her magic system works. And yes, I'm aware there's a difference between soft magic systems and hard magic systems, but the perfect example of a soft magic system would be something like Tolkien, where it's basically by the will of some variant or other of divine power, but there's still mechanics to Tolkien's magic system. Whereas with JK, they never explain. I mean, we get one lesson in the Philosopher's Stone or Sorcerer's Stone if you're American, where the way you wave the wand is somehow significant to how the spell is cast, and that aspect of the magic system is never brought up again. Why particular people um, develop magical abilities in the first place, never addressed within Harry Potter. The closest thing we get actually comes from one of the villains. Gellert Grindelwald says, basically, magic blooms within rare souls or souls with other noteworthy attributes. And honestly, given the house structures of Harry Potter and given the other like character traits of people with magic in the Harry Potter universe, while I don't support the magic Nazi uh, take that Grindelwald ended up displaying, that seems to be the closest thing we get to an actual explanation as to why or how magic manifests within Harry Potter. So, in absence of any other explanation, that's the explanation we kind of have to go with. But that's neither here nor there. Point being, anyone who was paranoid about Harry Potter turning your kids into witches, occultists, Satanists, however you want to call it, you were being dumb for entirely non-moralistic reasons because Harry Potter is not a good representation of those things. But back on point, J.K. Rowling lived long enough to be the living example of both moral panics.
I mean, I
Because
think there's another great example of both moral panics because apparently the left wing moral panic has wrapped all the way back around again to being against the gays for entirely different reasons for the right leaning moral panic, but the principle is basically the same because apparently a lot of gay people don't want to have sex with people who are trans because obviously when you're gay you're attracted to the same sex and obviously people are trans
gender
because
signifiers are sort of secondary to that, yeah. Um,
yeah, so it's like
or I'll give myself as an example here. It's not because I actually consider myself bisexual. I like men and women, although um, the ratio is a bit skewed for me. I'm about 70-30 split with regards to I prefer mostly men, and women that I find attractive are rarer. But here's the thing. As a bisexual dude, I will say for myself that not only do I prefer not only do I like both genders, but I actually have different beauty standards or different things I find attractive in both genders, i.e., my standards for what makes a woman attractive are non applicable to what makes a male person attractive, and vice versa. So I can totally understand that. Um, I forget what else I was going to add to that, but go on. Sorry.
but we're getting a lot of flack for not wanting to date transgender people and you know when you consider um, how people transition nowadays, I can't really blame them because, all right, it's either they, take hormones and dress a different way, but they don't actually go through the surgery, which is, so they,
Counterproductive.
yeah, so they don't have the surgery, which means they still have the physical anatomy of the gender they were born as. But if they do go through the
Yeah,
surgery,
they're both sex.
yeah, if they do go through the surgery, well, the thing is, like, you're not actually gaining the anatomy of the gender you want to transition to. You're gaining a poor facsimile of it.
Yeah, you're essentially a pantomime version of of what a person happens to be looking for. There's another parallel between the family values moral panic and the social justice moral panic in the form of the way they treat geek culture. Because if you remember during the Satanic Panic, you remember again the D&D paranoia, um, and or you remember the opposition to things like the goth movement or the punk movement. Now, despite um, nominally gaining nominally gaining respect for those things as usually some variation of the oppressed, quote unquote, which is another issue in and of itself. The modern day social justice moral panic hates geek culture when geek culture is in any way sincere or other than a piece of window dressing, because they love to appropriate these superficial trappings of geek culture. But when a geek displays something resembling sincerity or has an opposition to geek culture being conflated or inculcated with the social justice moral framework, i.e., being separate from it. If if you if you are a geek first and a quote unquote moral person second, you now get called things like toxic fandom or incels, usually both.
Yeah, we've seen that most recently with
It's not that they stopped persecuting nerds for exactly the same reasons that the previous generation persecuted nerds. It's that they need to include nerddom as an aspect of themselves, so they offloaded all of the negative connotations of geekery onto other terms, but still left the narratives that bind them intact.
yeah. So basically, instead of trying to destroy it, they're attempting to conquer it.
You want to enjoy a hobby separate from my moral framework? How dare you? And to be fair, back in the day, there were members of the family values moral panic who did try to moralize D&D rather than just getting rid of it. There were people who advocated and wrote letters to the people behind D&D to try and instill Christian imagery or Christian morality into the mechanics of the D&D mechanisms, to the point that they had a massive problem with the famous moral structure of D&D,
The
and
lawful good.
and they wanted good to literally basically just imply how firmly your character adheres to Christian values. Um, the only difference is back in the day, because the right leaning um, because the right leaning side of the spectrum was being the moralistic authoritarian ones with the tradcon family values, and the arts tended to be more lenient and therefore left leaning. The powers that be in those companies told those moral busybodies to go fuck themselves. However, now, because those very same people who told the right wing authoritarians to go fuck themselves are uncritically inculcating their own morality into the art forms, and they don't see the parallels between themselves and the tradcons. There's no one within the arts, or very few people within the arts, to actually tell the new authoritarians to go fuck themselves. And the ones that do are rare enough and atypical enough that they get to be demonized. For as much as I don't like EVS, he's a perfect example of this. He tries to say, hold on, we don't need all this social justice crap, and then out the door and into the invalid category. Now, mind you, he's a bad example of how to counter that, because his only issue seems to be that the morality being pushed wasn't his own, and that the issues of the actual infrastructure aren't actually problems, which is why I don't particularly like EPS. Because I'm a hardcore artist, simply shouldn't act this way, morality or no freaking morality. He seems to just want to flip, he just wants to flip the script. And there is a problem with that in the modern era, because you see people make the argument of the social justice moral panic is so bad, we have to return to tradconism and family valuesism as a counterweight. And again, my answer is no. Just because social justice happens to have the power at the moment doesn't mean it there it doesn't mean we all need to become Frederick Wortham and Jack Thompson all of a sudden. The correct
Uh,
answer, again, is move down and maybe a little bit to the right in order to counterbalance things, but the important part is the moving down into the libertarian side, not swapping out the moral panics.
Personally, from um, from the African American community, I've seen my community have a distinct lack of family values for quite a while now, and I feel like it's had a absolutely devastating effect on our community. So I would prefer it if we did drop more of those traditional family values. However, no way would I think it should ever be compulsory. I just it should be something that people adopt of their own free choice.
Yeah, and I also want to specify I'm not against the values of the family. I'm not against the nuclear family in any way. I'm not even against more traditional nuclear families. When I say family values, I mean family values as a capitalized proper noun and a ideological euphemism in the same way that I'm not against justice that happens to be social. I'm not against the civil rights movement, for example, or protesting in general. I am, however, against the ideology that calls itself social justice with a capital S and a capital J. It's it's the same thing, and this is another thing you often see in moral panics, no matter which side they're on. They will take a term which is universally unassailable, like family values,
Or BLM.
yeah, or social justice, or any number of other examples, and they will conflate it with a particular ideological framework that attaches itself to those things, and or they will capitalize those terms and make it a specific thing, but they will also conflate their specific version of those things with the universally lauded thing itself, i.e., you'll get somebody saying, if you're if you're in favor of family values, that necessarily means you don't want gay people getting married. Or if you're in favor of social justice, that necessarily means you think capitalism is softcore fascism and needs to be opposed by anarcho communists. Um, and so on and so forth. I.e., they will conflate something universal with something specific, and then when you criticize them on specific grounds, they will default back to I'm just doing this universally beloved thing. Therefore, you couldn't possibly have a problem with it and still be a morally good person. Because there's no way someone could be in favor of family values and not be in favor of family values. Or there's no way somebody could be in favor of social justice and not be in favor of social justice.
Yeah, that is a
My
tactic that
framework is the
I've
only
seen.
framework that's valid within this context, is usually the
Yeah,
rationale.
that is a tactic that I've seen people in BLM use far too often. And speaking of which, since I brought up BLM, they've been shown to basically just be one massive scam. So I have to wonder how much of the current moral panic do you think is people who truly believe in this hysteria versus how much do you think is just it's people who want to make a profit off of the existing hysteria and are therefore making things worse.
See, this is the funny thing though. It's not as simple as either or. Because even if you start from the premise of I'm going to opportunistically drift off of this, if you engage with it every single day, and what's more, if your entire culture engages with it every single day, you'll find yourself tacitly absorbing it to enough of a degree where the line between opportunistic grifting and sincere advocacy kind of becomes blurred to the point where you can't even figure out where one ends and the other begins anymore. And I think BLM is a perfect example of that. I think what happened was you had a bunch of ideological zealots who genuinely believed most of the shit they say, who realized they could make money off of it as well. And let's take the example. Let's say you firmly believe in a principled way in something, and then you find out that you can make money advocating for that thing you principally believe in. Does that mean you are being insincere, or does that mean you're just in a good place where you can make money doing what you would have been doing anyway?
Yes,
And
but I
does the
feel like
fact that you can make money at it undermine it? Now, it gets complicated when you consider that if you are the type of person who is susceptible to that blurring of the lines between opportunism um, and sincerity, if you're capable of compartmentalizing by way of cognitive dissonance, I'm making money at this and I sincerely believe in it. Are you going to be unwilling to draw a moral hard line when you do immoral shit for the greater good? And in most cases, the answer is no, especially with these sorts of moral Puritans. If they need to fudge the data a little bit, for example, or they need to be opportunistically slanderous towards someone in order to get the greater good, and that greater good also happens to line their pockets, I don't think I don't think it's going to bother them, because at that point I don't think they can see it, because they're so entrenched in the war and in their money, because you're essentially finding a way to serve both masters. You're finding a way to serve the master of, I need money for practical purposes, and I need to morally feel good whilst I'm doing it. That you can justify to yourself, yes, I'm opportunistically making money in this instance, and yes, I'm slandering someone to do it, but it's for the greater good ultimately, and I'm going to put that money towards a good use, so it doesn't matter. So I think the line is a bit blurrier than most people want to make it, whether it's pure opportunism or sincerity. I think it's often a case of it, and it doesn't even matter which end you start from. Eventually, if you eat, sleep, and breathe an ideology often enough, the line gets blurred, and then you find yourself essentially thinking like a warrior. You're thinking in terms of, I need to do this morally compromised thing to get my end away, and also I'm going to benefit from it. But that makes those sorts of people very hard to deconvert, because they're serving both sides of their nature by way of doing this. They're serving the, I need to feel morally good about this part of their nature, and they're serving the, I'm making so much money while doing something I like doing part of their nature, that it's
well,
next to
here's
impossible
the
to convert someone who is able to both grift and be sincere at the same time.
well, here's the thing though. Can you even say that they're being sincere when they say that they advocate for this thing? They say they want to do these things, but when they're giving truly staggering amounts of cash in order to accomplish these stated goals, they do nothing with it but enrich themselves.
Yes, because they have the capacity to rationalize. I'd rather believe that someone is deluded but sincere than I would be that they're sitting on their pile of money cackling like a James Bond villain. Because again, generally speaking, everyone everyone rationalizes their own personal narrative in their own head. It's
Well, here's the thing, though, Dalton. Regarding, especially in the case of BLM, we actually saw a video that they eventually took down because it made them look bad, of them sitting in a multi-million-dollar mansion, sipping champagne, cackling like villains.
Yes, but what were they cackling about? They were cackling about, remember when we used to say we only wanted to defund the police instead of abolish them? I.e., they were cackling about, they were hiding, but what they were hiding was the extremity of their moralism. It wasn't, we falsely claimed to be in favor of black issues, and now we've got their money, so haha. It was, we were moralistic zealots, but we hid our intentions behind a layer of plausible deniability, and now we have enough money where we don't have to anymore.
Well, another thing you also have to consider is that after they were able to achieve their fabulous wealth, they retired from the movement that they began. You would think that if they were truly committed to it, they wouldn't just walk away once they received the fat stacks of said cash.
No, that's something they can rationalize, and it's something they did rationalize as far as we know. They said, well, I've got my own now, so it's time for someone else to lead the movement. And yes, that's incredibly disingenuous, but here's the thing. I when you're this ideologically entrenched, I don't even think they can spot the contradiction anymore. Um, because again, they're the evolutionary part of their brain, the part of their brain that loves stuff more than abstract morality, is satisfied, and therefore that part of their brain is sort of skewing the moralistic part of their brain. And here's the other thing: you could even potentially see someone make the argument of, because I'm um, laid down with this much wealth, I might not be a good servant of this ideology anymore. So the most ethical thing I can do within my own framework is step down. And I think in order to get themselves to sleep at night on their fat stacks of money, that's probably something analogous to the lie they tell themselves. They tell themselves that even if they did do a moral wrong by taking all this money and making themselves wealthy with it, at least they did the morally righteous thing in the end and stepped down from the movement so the movement could proceed without their influence.
But yeah, but the thing is, once you corrupt something, it is damn near impossible to uncorrupt it. Even if
Well, I mean, to be fair, the ideological framework behind Black Lives Matter was corrupt to begin with, because as they famously came right out and said, because they were morally proud of it, we were trained Marxists, derp. So nothing moral could come out of this framework, but that doesn't stop people from sincerely believing that that is the moral thing to do. Because
yeah,
there are Marxists who genuinely advocate Marxism while simultaneously not being able to stop themselves from being self-interested, because humans are generally self-interested.
look, they retired from the movement, but the person that they handed them off to is just as corrupt as they were. Like,
Yeah,
you
because
introduce
they don't
rot into
realize
this
there's
thing.
no digging themselves out of the hole, would
Yeah,
be
you
my guess.
introduce rot into an organism, the rot's going to spread, and eventually you're not going to be able to cut it away without destroying
Especially
the
when
entire thing.
the organism in question was predisposed to rot to begin with, because your measured your metric of taking care of it was doing things that would literally inculcate rot into it. But again, it's the difference between us looking in from the outside and someone from the inside not realizing that, to paraphrase a famous meme, they are the baddies. And that's the thing with moral panics. They can do a lot of bad shit and still rationalize to themselves that they're not the baddies. And only when they have that aha moment of, oh wait, shit, I'm the baddie, do is there any hope of them being um converted, quote unquote. And
You know,
maybe that's one of the reasons why so much of the social justice movement is predicated on guilt, because the people who now swear up and down about social justice, a lot of them used to be the family values tradcons. And the main way that social justice perpetuated itself outside academia was, here is all this data of all the bad shit your generation and the generation before you did wrong. Don't you feel guilty? And maybe in that moment, maybe that was the moment where people converted from, or rather, the aristocracy converted from primarily being focused around tradcon family values to primarily being focused on deconstructive social justice, because someone was able to make the, here is all the bad shit you did wrong, you feel guilty now, and here is the solution to your guilt. If you side with social justice, you can simultaneously still have been a tradcon once upon a time, but fix the problem and therefore not feel guilty anymore.
Yeah, but the thing is, the way in which they attempt to fix the problem just creates entirely.
Yeah, no, it's going to create an entirely different problem because, again, rather than move diagonally, um they moved from one side to the other, i.e., they went from being authoritarian moralists on the right wing side to being authoritarian moralists on the left wing side, and they don't even realize they're still being authoritarian moralists.
Yeah, there was actually a graph that I remember seeing about how the left wing and right wing have shifted over time, say like the last 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the it showed that the right wing was always right wing and has shifted a little bit further to the right to further to the right than where they were like 30 years ago. Like they shifted,
I
but
would
not
also
anymore.
wager that the right has moved down if we're talking about in political compass
Yeah,
terms, because
yeah,
uh,
that
maybe not in the maybe not in the official political spectrum yet, although I'd say give it a few years. But on the ground, libertarianism of various different kinds is far, far more appealing than tradcon family values, because most people who are currently right wingers remember the stupidity of the tradcon era, i.e., your sticks, hex, and hammers, your razor fists, your um, I would say even Trumps to some degree, and that's why we're currently in a situation where I would say the most significant plurality of right wingers is the libertarian populist right wing, and the most significant plurality of left wingers are the authoritarian moralist left wing.
all right, back back to the graph that I was talking about. Uh, the right wing has shifted a bit over the last 30 years, but the left wing, it showed, had shifted much further to the left over the last 30 years. But the interesting part is where they put the median. See, the place where they put the median isn't where the median would have been 30 years ago, which would have been a more accurate way of, showing the shift over time. They put it where the median would be today. So when you look at the graph where the median is, it showed that the left 30 years ago was on the right side of the median, and then it went further left, and the right was far right, instead of putting it where it would have been 30 years ago, where it would have been the right to the right, but not necessarily far right, and the left is to the left, and then it goes way off far left.
Mm-hmm. I think that is probably an affectation of certainty, because back in the day, the people who were on the quote unquote right side of history were the libertarian left, the the freedom of expression loving, punk movement endorsing, goth movement endorsing left. And the people that were on the wrong side of history were the Bible thumping, paranoid evangelical right. And so the right, I think, learned its lesson and went, hang on, we really fucked up here. Let's take a while and not move anywhere particular to figure out where we went wrong. Whereas the left knew they were justified back in the day because they were. The problem is, because they were certain that they had the right answer, they assumed that any answer within their own framework would be right, which resulted in them going further and further and further into their own framework. Because if we were right 40 years ago, then obviously the left wing side of the spectrum is the correct side of the spectrum, and we need to push it as far as we can go because it's the right answer, surely. So how can we go wrong if we just keep going further along the correct axis? Whereas the right is going, hang on, we were very wrong the last time around. We should pace ourselves because clearly we had some stuff wrong we should work out before we go any further.
Yeah, I think the greatest example of this can be shown in the abortion issue. After Roe v. Wade was overturned, the right are saying, okay, we are opposed to abortion, but it should be a state by state issue rather than a national issue.
Yeah, it,
Whereas
it
people
it
who live
used to
in
be a hardcore
various
no
states,
abortion, no nothing issue, and
yeah,
now it's like, well, we've come around to the idea of yeah, saying no never would be a bad thing, so we'll keep it within reasonable constraints, which used to be the like no duh centrist position, but whatever.
yeah, it's basically saying like if people in a certain state want to have free access to abortion, like this this is America. The state should be able to
Yeah, so much
do
the
that.
better. Yeah, basically.
And if we live in a state that wants to, restrict abortion, like we in our state should be able to make that the way we live.
It's also worth noting how few states actually went ahead and tried to full stop ban it. Everyone defaulted to what used to be the centrist position, which says to me that the right wing has at least learned a little bit. And again, I think that's an affectation of the fact that the actual impetus on the right is actually on the lower right rather than the upper right, i.e., people back in the day laughed at tradcon evangelicals and their family values, and I think for the most part, people today still laugh at tradcon family values. There is still some affectation of it, like for example, um, I saw someone try to. I saw I saw a school board. Um, I saw a school board try to ban the graphic novel Mouse during a Holocaust discussion week because it was too sexual, quote unquote. So there are still waiting in the wings tradcons, and that's why I advocate so strongly against both varieties of moral panic and against moral panics in general because I don't care which side you're on. I don't want to live in Pleasantville any more than I want to live in San Angeles painted rainbow, i.e., stop with the moral panicking. Everyone should be some variation on libertarian and populist because libertarian populism tends to go pretty right no matter where it's tried, whereas moralistic authoritarianism tends to fuck over freedom of expression and people's enjoyment of their lives everywhere it's tried, one way or the other.
I think um, I think one difference between the two more panics though is uh, standards. I believe that the right authoritarian hysteria wanted to restrict people to very extreme standards, whereas the current left wing hysteria is trying to tear down most standards.
Um, I disagree. You're not wrong, but I think there might be a syllogism going on here. Um, because the thing is, they don't want to abolish standards. They want to abolish other people's standards. Whereas their standards are so sacrosanct that if you have a problem with it, you are the devil. Take, for example, the turf versus non-turf issue. And again, apologies to Lady J.K. Rowling that you lived long enough to see yourself be attacked on both sides from a moralistic point of view. Um, or if you have a problem with Antifa, you are the devil. Or if you are a member of any number of the pop culture gates, you are the devil. They still want morally strict standards. They just want their own morally strict standards. And the problem they have, at least from their own point of view, is they see anything that could resemble the world as it was 20 years ago as an affectation of the TradCon moral standards. And they basically want to clean house entirely and replace the TradCon moral standards altogether, whether they actually are TradCon moral standards or not, with their own moral standards.
Though I think one big difference between the two is the source with the right with the you know traditionalist moral panic. It was, I believe, largely based in religion, and so the source for that was them saying, okay, we are getting these morals and standards from a higher authority than ourselves. Therefore, we must adhere to them and make sure that everybody else adheres to them as well. I personally believe they were mistaken in their interpretation of such things, but
Yeah.
but with the left wing hysteria, they aren't appealing to a authority higher than themselves.
Uh, Contraire. Because, say it with me now, believe the science.
Well, the thing is, they are like human beings are the scientists. Like they are the ones who are, reaching these
Yeah, but
conclusions.
they're not deferring to the human beings in service to the science. They're essentially being, for lack of a better word, platonic. They believe that the science itself is a a a higher epistemological standard. I think the main difference is we swapped the church for the academy. And the problem with swapping the church for the academy is um, consensus actually stifles science, and consensus actually stifles the growth of academic rigor, which is the source, or in a sane world would be the source of any authority, quote unquote, that science had. As I alluded to last week, authority is meant to be a byproduct of substance, whereas in a orthodoxy based system or a normative based system, um, substance is almost considered to be a byproduct of the authority rather than the authority being a byproduct of the substance. And the authority, I guess you could say that we're alluding to now, isn't even science necessarily, but it's the orthodoxy of the science. And the thing is, in the sciences, as we've seen many a time over, um, the orthodoxy tends to very often be wrong. There's a famous example of a doctor named Ignaz Semmelweis, who was one of the first doctors to experiment with hand washing um, in relation to surgery. And he realized that by doing so, he could reduce the rate um,
Post-op infections.
post-op infections and specifically child deathbed syndrome by a factor of like 60%.
Yeah, didn't he
Now,
work in a
mind you,
maternity hospital?
huh?
Didn't he work in a maternity hospital?
I believe so. Um, but um, the problem was the current scientific establishment of the time was caught somewhere between the four humors theory and what was known as the nervous excitation theory of disease. And washing your hands during surgery made no sense within either of these frameworks. And so, despite the fact that he had the data, despite the fact that he had the numbers, he was blackballed by the scientific establishment. until, of course, some headway was made in germ theory several decades after. But by that point, Dr. Semmelweis had died penniless and alone, basically as a disgraced scientist.
I mean, we
And
could see that a lot in the modern era too. I mean, if anybody had any findings that didn't meet with the consensus regarding the biological quandary of 2020, um, they were roundly dismissed and um, basically excommunicated from the wider scientific community,
and I
even
mean,
though many of the prevailing opinions were shown to be now incorrect.
yeah. And getting back to the point of our stream today, you have a moral framework within particularly the soft sciences that have now spread slowly but surely into many of the hard sciences, i.e., the framework of social justice. And if you happen to be a historian or an anthropologist or a psychologist or even just a economist or a hard scientist that finds um, data in contradiction to social justice or outside of the social justice framework or validate a framework outside of social justice, you are not even just mistaken, you are immoral, and your information is dangerous and considered misinformation, not because it lacks substance, but because we have defined it as invalid in the abstract, because we have presupposed this framework, and therefore anything outside of this framework is wrong by definition. Look at James Damore, look at Jordan Peterson, um, uh, look at Paul Elam, look at Warren Farrell. All of these people have academic credentials that prior to their coming out as a heretic were bordering on immaculate. But now, it doesn't matter if he's been a clinical psychologist for 40 years and has been cited in many, many other highly respectable clinical psychologist works. Jordan Peterson is against the framework of social justice, and therefore he is by definition wrong.
Yeah, it's gotten to the point of being so ridiculous. Remember when Marvel made him into the Red Skull?
Yes, I do. And speaking of which, it reminds me a lot of particularly during the what was the parallel I was going I thought of some parallels that I wanted to talk about while I was in the bath earlier today. And now I can't. Oh, Holy Terror. Remember Holy Terror? Remember what an anti-Muslim screed that was? That was basically Frank Miller's therapy comic from basically 9/11 PTSD that he wanted
I
to
believe so.
do with Batman, and DC was like, "Fuck no, we're not letting you do this with Batman. Make up your own character." So he made up a character called the Fixer. Compare that and its moral charge to Jordan Peterson Red Skull. It's staggering how many logical parallels there are between these two things, and or concrete demonstrable parallels like with the J.K. Rowling thing. It's almost like it doesn't matter which way the moralism is pointing, we should just stop the moralism.
Yeah, and the thing is, regarding entertainment, whenever these people fail, and they always do, because the things that they create aren't
Are
something that the average person wants, it's
Yeah,
never that they were wrong. It's that everybody else was wrong for not supporting it.
yeah, they're immoral for not liking the thing, and to be fair, they did the tradcons and the family values types did the same thing back in the day. If you didn't like a Christian propaganda movie, for example, you were immoral. But And what's more, if you did like something that went against the current moral zeitgeist, like for example The Craft, people don't remember this probably, but when it came out in 1996, The Craft was a huge battleground. Um, that's a large part of the reason why it's rated R, because watch it today and I guarantee you it's nothing harder than a PG-13, but because it was pro witchcraft, rated R it is. But yeah, it the more things change, the more they stay the same. Not only are you immoral for not liking the thing you're supposed to like, you're doubly immoral for liking the thing we have determined you're not supposed to like. Which the parallel there is, of course, 2019's Joker, if everyone remembers that little canard.
Yeah,
You
there was
like
a
you
big there
like
was a big
Joker
panic
instead of
about.
liking Birds of Prey? How dare you? You like Sonic instead of liking Birds of Prey? How dare you? We've determined those people are immoral.
Not only that, but there was a big panic about how the movie would spark violence, and about how
Yeah.
there might be people who would bring guns to the movie theaters, which did not happen.
No, because unsurprisingly, the movie was so universally good and universally beloved that people, honestly, in basically every framework I can come up with, found something to enjoy in Joker. The left wing had its, this is what happens when social programs go bust narrative, or, the sympathy for the mentally ill narrative. You had um, the right wing talking about this is what happens when you have a decaying society and yada yada yada. You had the men's rights movement very much lionized a a sympathetic narrative for Arthur, where it's like it's almost a perfect parallel for men's rights issues. Um, you had the centrists going, "This is what happens when um, there isn't civil discourse," or "This is what happens when people don't have empathy for each other," and so on and so forth. Everyone found something to like in Joker, except for the critics, ironically, because critics, especially in this day and age, are obsessed with the meta narrative. They are obsessed with this is the one correct answer to this movie. This is the one lesson that this movie is supposed to take, or that I'm supposed to take from this movie. And I will judge this movie based on whether or not I like that lesson or not, or what I assume the lesson to be. Whereas Joker, because it was so three dimensional and worked on multiple levels and was well rounded, i.e., it wasn't a one dimensional single. This is the moral of the story movie. It was a here is a three dimensional portrayal of all the problems from all the various different perspectives, or at least some attempts to go for them. It confused the fuck out of critics because they wanted a single "this is what the movie is saying" tagline or lesson, and instead they got an accurate portrayal of the world from multiple vectors at once.
Yeah, Joker is an example of somebody with a genuine artistic vision, genuinely trying to make something good while also having something
Yeah,
to say about the world.
yeah. It's here. Let me accurately portray the world, tweak it a little bit, and then let the chips fall where they may. Because I'm well aware that I might not have all the answers, but I'm going to accurately portray the questions at least. What do you know? It's almost like it's more meaningful for art to be three dimensional instead of having a one size fits all theme, which is why I slowly am getting more and more blackpilled on the very concept of insisting themes into art. Anyway, that's a different story for a different day. But yes, compare the reaction in the '90s to The Craft to the reaction to Joker. It's very eerily similar when you get right down to it. In Joker's case, it was incels and mass shootings. In Craft's case, it was encouraging the punk movement, the goth movement, and witchcraft.
Okay, we've been going for almost 2 hours, so I feel like this is a good place to call it. Do you have any final thoughts, Dalton?
No, although it's sort of ironic that we ended up bringing it back to something like The Craft right as we were ending up, because come back next week for the Duality of Man Halloween special, where we will say probably one of the most controversial things we'll ever say here, which is the witch trials and or witchcraft are not a woman's issue, despite what the current zeitgeist wants to insist. Witchcraft and witch trials are not a woman's issue. So bring your pitchforks and torches to fillet us, guys. You might need them.
Yeah. I actually have a joke for that, but I'll save it for next week.
Mm-hmm.
So, for all of those of you watching, I've been Mr. E.
I've been Dalton Mortimer, the Authenticator. We have been the Duality of Man. Cheers, guys.